Hello and welcome back to News World here on Newsroom Africa, Channel 405. Thank you for joining us. Now, heavy rains have killed at least 10 people, 10 people, and displaced more than 200,000 in Somalia, destroying infrastructure and tainting the economy. The floods left Somalia's houses submerged in water, and a tropical storm next week is expected to worsen the floods, and humanitarian organizations are warning of waterborne diseases and mass displacement. Now, the seasonal rainfalls have also left thousands displaced in Kenya and South Sudan. Joining us now in studio is Jamie Mighty to unpack some of the floods happening in East Africa. Jamie, thank you for joining us on News World this evening.
Always a pleasure.
Aid agencies are warning that more floods in coming weeks and coming months. I mean, this has been happening for the last year in parts of East Africa. Let's just maybe look at this, the warnings. How are aid agencies, how are people on the ground prepared for what's to come?
So it looks like this is becoming a new feature in our climatological environment in Africa. So obviously the UN agencies are trying to raise as much money as they can, get medical personnel on the ground, give people the information that they need, because especially with floods, you do get the displacement of people from their houses, but then you also have to deal with the risk of cholera, you've got to deal with the risk of diarrhea, and you've got to also deal with the real risk of drowning. And sometimes because the water submerges a lot of stuff, people sometimes step on glass, and if you don't have emergency response teams, a lot of people can actually die from avoidable fatalities. So if you look at the responses in Africa as compared to some of the extreme weather events in America, we fall far behind. But what's more interesting really is juxtaposing this with what's happening in SADC. Because what you see in North Africa is these floods, but what you see in Southern Africa is the drought. And both of these are as a result of the extreme weather patterns which are being caused by global warming, global heating, whichever political phrase you prefer.
They're calling it a phenomenon that's actually happening in the Indian Ocean as well. I mean, where temperatures are hot temperatures and cooling temperatures, and as a result of this, it's forcing rain in the region, which is quite unprecedented for the areas where these floods are happening. I mean, another thing in these flood-affected areas, we're talking of Kenya, we're talking Sudan, we're talking
Central African
Republic, we're talking Somalia. Is that a lot of these places, the challenge here is that they have conflict. So obviously the floods is affecting this, and aid agencies' response to the floods, because they're also dealing with the conflict in these zones. I mean, how are they equipped to deal with all of these?
So the conflict adds another layer of complexity, because when you're dealing with natural disasters, there is a geological component to it, but there's also a socio-economic component to it. So what that means is that there are human conditions that exacerbate the actual manifestations of the problem. So if you look at places like Somalia, because of the fighting, because of the instability in the region, it becomes more difficult to bring in Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, because the people who are controlling the areas still want to get rewards for opening up access to those areas. So sometimes the missions have to now start paying to access the people that they're trying to help. So it adds complexity to that. And you see the same thing when you look at countries like Zimbabwe, for instance, where you've got 14 million people in the country and 7 million are facing the risk of starvation. So the UN is trying to bring in resources, but at the same time they're trying to do all of that, the government is messing up the situation on the ground. So you've got the socio-economic element, the human element coming together with the fact that the weather has turned against the area.
I mean, like, while we're on the topic of access, I mean, another challenge to the flooding in this region is accessing some of these areas, because roads have been devastated, buildings have been devastated, infrastructure, bridges, that sort of thing. So that also adds another element to how aid is being provided to these affected regions.
Absolutely. I mean, first off, you got to look at some areas. Some areas don't even have roads. And when you start having flooding and you don't have tarred roads, what then happens is that what would have been a simpler trip in a Jeep or in a heavy-duty truck can no longer be carried because the road gets muddy. So something that would have taken 1 day ends up taking 25 days. So in areas where there's underdevelopment of the areas, it becomes particularly difficult to do emergency relief. So in some areas, especially in Somalia, what they're trying to do now is to find landing strips, because everything has to be done by air. But because so much of the area is flooded, now the people who are flying in, whether it's helicopters or small aircrafts, are now struggling to to actually come in and bring in the resources. So sometimes they have to rely on the aerial drop-offs, but now people have to go and look for the drugs, et cetera, et cetera. It adds a layer of complexity. If you look at places like DRC, which is not a topic in point right now, but it's so difficult even there to bring in relief, because how do you actually access the areas? One, you're dealing with guerrillas. Two, you're dealing with the poor infrastructure. Then you're dealing with the extreme weather itself. Then you're dealing with the lack of political will. Then you're dealing with the fact that those particular governments have no budget for emergency relief. Then the question then becomes, should the AU come together and make a sort of emergency relief fund? Because the African countries individually are always facing one challenge or another. But if there's a collective body that can then release funds, you know, that can be administrated in a transparent way, maybe the AU is the body to do it. Because right now we have probably the worst emergency relief in the world.
All right, while we're on the topic of how we respond to aid relief in this sort of emergency, maybe we should also talk about donor fatigue. We obviously have the situation on the African continent where we have many problems. You know, it's not the conflict, and now we have the flooding situation. You mentioned the AU, you mentioned maybe government's response. Earlier I asked you how aid agencies are responding, but how have governments now responded to the crisis happening on the continent in terms of the flooding in that particular region?
Yeah, so well, I mean, the UN is always the place where the UN agencies go to look for relief. There is some donor fatigue when it comes to this kind of stuff. And we have to realize now that this is the new normal. So I actually don't think that the way to solve this is through donors.
Or requesting for additional aid.
Yeah, so I think what we need to do as Africans is this. The mineral resources come from Africa. Everybody knows that. The consumption of these goods and products happens in Europe, in China, and in America. So the West is the responsible agent for most of the pollution. We are suffering as a result of their pollution. So there needs to be some kind of pressure put on them.
Or consequence.
Yes, yes. And that has to be, whether it's a carbon tax or a pollution levy or something. One, it creates a deterrent towards further pollution, but two, then that can become the fund to alleviate. Can you imagine, you've never had an iPad, you've never had an iPhone, you've never driven a car, and you're drowning in Somalia because the Americans buy an iPhone and an iPad every year. That is the most unjust system that the world has ever seen. For someone to be struggling in the Central African Republic, they are probably living in shacks without electricity, without clean water. And because Americans are guzzling fuel,
using their resources for the iPads and the iPhones.
Do you see what I mean?
Right.
So there needs to be some kind of a call to action, not at the point of we're begging for money, but to say, listen, you guys are the main actors in this pollution, so you guys have to pay for it. And you guys are the ones extracting the resources. Africans really don't participate in the pollution problem or the global warming problem to any material extent, right? So China, America, Germany, those big polluters, they then need to come to a point where they tax their companies, because you know, sometimes what happens is the countries say, well, it's not us. You know, we don't make the Mercedes-Benz, we don't make this particular thing, but they are hosting those companies. So there needs to be some kind of a tax that then comes back through the UN for this relief. I don't think we need to be begging.
An accountantability tax is
I think
what you're
so.
suggesting.
Exactly, let's call it that, an accountability environmental tax that comes directly to the most affected. It seems so gregarious or egregious rather, that we are the ones who suffer as a result. I mean, it's so hot in Johannesburg right now. You know, people see us wearing these jackets in the studios, but it's so hot, and this is the new norm because of the global pollution created by other agents aside from Africans.
I mean, you can be the strongest of denialists, but one can't deny that this is a climate issue. I mean, particularly in the area where these floods are happening now in East Africa and Central Africa, it's unprecedented. I mean, they don't get that amount of rainfall, and this is why it's happening. And that's why, you know, not economists, climatologists rather, have attributed to that, this phenomenon that's currently happening in the Indian Ocean. I mean, let's talk about the other legacies of a situation or a crisis like this. I mean, we know some of the challenges. We know that you know, there's a food shortage currently in South Sudan. Now it's been further exacerbated by the flooding, obviously, because crops have been damaged, livestock have been killed. We know that there's a risk of illness. We know hunger. But let's also talk about children, because children are often the biggest victims or the most vulnerable at times of crisis. I mean, education. And what legacy does this sort of impact have?
So there's an interesting case study because there was a drought in Matabeleland in the early 80s, right? And because of a lack of support, that area actually became one of the underdeveloped areas in Zimbabwe as a result of a lack of adequate response. The drought was between 1980 to about 1985. And it's a case study that demonstrates what happens in underprivileged environments when you are dealing with childhood development, because this is projected to last for a reasonable amount of time. So that can stunt early childhood development, but children are more vulnerable to a variety of sicknesses. When your sanitation system is basically destroyed, which is what happens when you have these kind of situations. The cleanliness of the water, the floods, we're dealing with mosquitoes, we're dealing with cholera, we're dealing with diarrhea, we're maybe dealing with some waterborne diseases aside from those. So if the emergency personnel cannot access the areas, then these particular actors are the most at risk, not just in the short to medium term, but for the foreseeable future, because this is literally their developmental years. It's different when you're 22 or 25, but when you're 6 years old, the kind of stuff that happens in a situation where you have had massive floods, besides the destruction of schools, that's definitely going to set you back. But we're looking at
education.
Yeah, we're looking at diseases. We're looking at supplying them with food.
Effects.
The psychological effect. Lives are lost. Homes displaced. This is very disruptive. And to go back a little bit to that point, is that Africa is suffering as if you have fires in California, they're regrettable, but they pollute a lot in California. They didn't take the necessary steps they needed to do to make sure they manage that stuff. But in Africa, we've been living on subsistence farming. Many of the African communities are still very agrarian, right? But we are suffering as a result of Western pollution. But secondarily, poor management. We mustn't take the African leaders, off the firing block because they failed to come up with environmental interventions. There are ways to mitigate the impact of drought. We know about irrigation. We know about drought-resistant types of plants and crops, but they haven't been aggressive in doing that. So then when the drought hits, they act like victims.
All right, thank you, Jamie Mighty. There you go. Is Western population perhaps a reason for why we're currently facing the climate challenges on the continent, particularly the East and Central African region going through unprecedented flooding right now? Jamie Mighty also bringing up some points about the effects, the legacy that this sort of catastrophe has on children, and also maybe an accountability tax. Thank you for unpacking some of the recent floodings on the continent. Newsworld's going to take a short break, but when we come back, we're going to talk to a woman who is breaking the glass ceiling when it comes to ICT.